You're listening to episode 277 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Kyira Korrigan joins us to speak about working with hatred. Hi everyone. I want to thank you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of that dana, we're able to continue offering this podcast, the discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in our lives. Think back to a time when you were really, really angry. What was that like? How did it feel? Constricted or open? Heavy or light? Calm and peaceful or agitated and perhaps even violent? And perhaps most important, what were your words and actions like? Did they positively move you and those around you forward? My personal edge is the arising of reactive anger. It's quick. It's hurtful for me and my loved ones. And it's the main reason I practice every day. Meditation is not a cure-all, but may provide some help to lessen the habit of that reactivity and shift to response. Kyira Korrigan is a committed student and teacher of the Buddha Dharma. Her focus is on the Pali Suttas, with healthy portions of Frere, hooks, and A.K. Press mixed in to round out the taste of liberation. She serves as a full-time chaplain in a Med-Max security men's prison in British Columbia, Canada. So sit back, relax, and have a nice red rage tea. Our guest today is Kyira Korrigan. Kyira, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be on it.
Very glad to be speaking with you because we had a chance. Our first meeting was just essentially last week at a symposium at Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And I knew right away that I wanted to speak with you and give voice to a lot of the things we're going to unpack here because they're very uncommon things to show up within context of the practice. And I really wanted to bring your voice in to share about that. But let's start by having you say a bit about your background, maybe how you first encountered Buddhism or contemplative practice.
Well, let's see. I'm 45 now, and I started studying Buddhism about 20 years ago. What led me to Buddhism starts before that, though. Mm-hmm. So I had been a very politically active and intelligent teenager, I guess you'd say. I really read a lot about politics at a young age. I got very involved first with animal rights and then with feminism and then with gay and lesbian rights. And that was before we had the full alphabet. So it was just gay and lesbian rights back in the 80s. And then I landed in university in South Carolina, and got really involved with anti-racist work. And through that time, I felt empowered and I felt driven and I felt like I was tapping into really important issues. I also began to realize that I was drowning in hatred. I was just losing my capacity to enjoy waking up in the morning. And that led me to two things. It led me to leave the United States, which is where I grew up, and immigrate to Canada. And it led me to a really hard period of my life where I began to make choices that were going to really hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
I got involved with phone sex work and then stripping and then drugs, and I got quite overwhelmed by my efforts to metabolize everything I was putting into my life. And that's when I think I hit bottom, and I thought I need to find a spiritual path, because I trust that spiritual path has something that can bring meaning back into my life. But I didn't want to have to believe in anything that I could not trust was real. And luckily I moved to Vancouver, and in Vancouver there's a lot of Buddhist temples, and that Buddhist temple near me had a free class in English every week. And I went there in the very first class. I was like, oh, this stuff is exactly what I wanted. It's a deep and rich tradition with incredible resources for facing life's challenges. It deals with what is actually happening in the world and offers insight and comfort and trainings that I can do to face what the world can be like, good and bad. And I don't need to believe in anything that is, I don't need to have a faith-based approach. I don't need to have the center core of my path be faith. Instead, the center core of my path is direct experience. And I found that much more trustworthy. So right away, and that would be, like I said, 1995, so 20 years ago, I right away just committed to Buddhism as my path and pursued it as strongly and with as much integrity as I could.
And I like the way you describe in there, just pausing briefly, that this was something that was eminently pragmatic to you. This had meaning in your life, and it wasn't something that you had to take on faith. It was something you could see in the world, you could see in your own life.
Right. And because I had done so much work with social justice, civil rights, fighting for civil rights, studying and critiquing of modern society, I wasn't interested in a kind of a palliative religious teaching that would say, well, it's all Maya, or, well, this is all just the mistakes of the ignorant and education will save us.
Right.
I feel like there is an incredible power in humans to do ill or good, and that is not something we should try and erase or whitewash or somehow make comfortable. Whatever path I was going to take, I wanted it to face that head on and never compromise on a kind of realism. So it's not so much even pragmatism, I would have said, that attracted me, but realism. Mm-hmm. And realism that held within it also a teaching of profound, boundless compassion. How great is that, to offer boundless compassion, boundless wisdom. At the same time, we say everything can be a place where suffering arises. It's an amazing power to be willing to have so much absolute, in the sense of just categorical absolutes. Boundlessness is sort of a non-absolute absolute. and to be so realistic and to all be focused on just the human life. It was just the right combination of acknowledgement of the strength of humanity, or being a human, and also the capacity to develop something profound beyond belief.
So how did this continue to unfold in your life over the course of the next 2 decades?
Well, at the time that I started to study Buddhism, I was also just beginning to teach yoga. I'd come to yoga first, hatha yoga, postural yoga. That was sort of my first step towards Dharma, and practiced just on my own, hours a day. And one day I met a woman in passing, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're a yoga teacher." I said, "Well, I'm not a yoga teacher. I do yoga." She said, "No, you're a yoga teacher. I'm going to India and I need someone to teach all my classes for 3 months. Can you do it?" And I was basically unemployed. I was working a little bit as a bodyguard because I have a martial arts background. And I said, "All right, I'll come teach your yoga classes. I know what martial arts classes look like. I can teach those." So, and that quickly led me into a full-time work as a yoga teacher. And because of my own preferences, I ended up teaching at a lot of marginalized communities. And each of those classes were opportunities to take Dharma into the world, to channel Dharma, to try and live in Dharma. So I would teach yoga, teach the essence of Buddha Dharma as I understood it, and then come home and practice. And that was about 15 years of just training on my own. And during that time, I met Noah Levine, who had just written Dharma Punks. I met him just a few months after Dharma Punks got published. And I started to invite him up to Vancouver. And through hosting him to give talks in Vancouver, I developed a Buddhist community to be part of called DIY Dharma, Do It Yourself Dharma. And yeah, a lot of my path has been just looking for the places where I fit and then committing a lot of energy into developing that community. Because I hadn't, before I met Noah, I hadn't really felt like I fit anywhere. I practiced for a few years in Tibetan Buddhism, and then I felt fairly hierarchical, and there was a lot of power dynamics I wasn't comfortable with. And then I studied for a few more years in a Zen school, and I felt like there wasn't a lot of compassion and expressive freedom, and it was a sort of a cool tone to the community. And so, yeah, I just created a lot of the path myself. I can't say I didn't even really get a teacher or belong to a lineage, and I still don't really think of myself having teacher or lineage exactly. I did study with Noah for a while, and did go through a ceremony with him that was part of I guess you'd call it a kind of empowerment to teach. Then I went to get my master's in Buddhism, and that's been really a contributing it contributed a lot to my path. But I've done a lot of this on my own, and I've done a lot of this, I guess you'd say, on the ground or in the streets.
It's interesting to hear that some of what you're running into as far as power dynamics or a feeling tone of coolness, things like that, are quite common. I do hear that from others who, like me, grew up as a Midwest American, and my particular way of engaging with the world was a little bit different than the hierarchical structures and the expectations around. It's great to question as long as the answer you come up with is this. That doesn't work so well for me. And so it's interesting to hear your own creative way of engaging with what is still the Dharma in your own life.
Yeah, there's sort of a kind of a suspicion, I'll say, a subtle suspicion that can be directed, I feel is directed at me for not having good qualifications. But what I have used to be my ground is primary text. I'm quite a primary text geek. And so the Pali Suttas and the writings of the early Indian Mahayana, Nagarjuna, especially, and then going through into the Mahayana texts and even the Tibetan texts, but really sticking with the texts and sticking close to the source and taking those texts and the teachings there into my daily life every day, trying to apply the text or the teaching as I understand it, and then see what the outcome is and use that to reapply myself to study, to then take it into the world and see how it works. I feel like, well, I have a chemistry degree. My father was a scientist, an engineer, and I feel like between the two things, I was really taught to approach the world with a scientific mind. Mm-hmm. And I really approached Dhamma with a scientific mind of this is an experimental process of adjusting my own life choices based on what I observe and the consequences for myself and others of what I'm trying to do versus what I'm getting. And I find that incredibly trustworthy. Yeah. So many times I've gone to retreat fairly convinced that I may not know at all what I'm doing and come out the other end realizing, oh, no, I've been fine. I've been on the path, well established. And I knew that because life was affirming the Dhamma, and the Dhamma was describing what I was seeing in life. And what is more trustworthy than that?
Yeah, I like that. I like the way you characterize that it's describing what we see in life. So something you mentioned earlier, Kyira, was about anger, about hatred. And I'm wondering if you might say more about that as our segue into that as our topic for this conversation.
Well, I can say that there was a time in my life where I had to take I didn't have to, but I chose to take an emotions questionnaire. What do you feel? What is your emotional palette or your emotional characteristic? And when I went through it, the only words that described the emotions I felt regularly were anger, frustration, and hatred. And that was pretty accurate description of my emotional palette in my late teens, early 20s especially. So that was what I started off with when I started to meditate. I remember the first retreat I went to was a Goenka style retreat, of Vipassana retreat. And I was so angry by the 8th day. All I was willing to do was sit and seethe and chant in my head, screw you, Goenka. I'm not doing what you tell me. Screw you, Goenka. I'm not doing what you tell me. I couldn't meditate for another year after that because I built up so much hatred. And I knew it was poisonous, but I knew it was based in a desire to see things change for better. And so I've just worked with it for many years. I've worked with my own hatred, my own anger. And I'm using hatred here in a broad categorical sense, that includes sort of a Dhamma sense of the klesha hatred that includes everything from mild irritation to deep defensive rejection to actual feelings of loathing and wishes of ill will, just the whole big smelly pile that is rejection of what is. And it's a pretty dominant force in my life, but it's also been my enemy because I feel like so much of what marginalizes communities is dominant communities, hatred of the marginal, and the desire to find a scapegoat for one's hatred. And so it's an odd thing to be both trying to reduce hatred in the world and also in myself while I feel immersed in a culture that's filled with hatred and I'm also filled with hatred. And because that has been my experience, that's just been a lot of my focus. I can also say there's been a specific kind of anger or hatred context that's been really part of my life, which is around men's violence against women. I work now as a prison chaplain, so I work in a federal prison in Canada with male offenders, and that's in contrast to where I sort of started my activist life, which was really close to the opposite. In a rape shelter for women who had been victims of rape, filled with loathing and animosity towards the perpetrators of sexual violence. And then within this context is my own experiences of conflict with men and violence. So there's been this particular story that I have chewed on from many angles that my Dharma practice has been really integrated with, which is, what do I do with rape? What do I do with a bigger person using their strength to dominate a smaller person? Because it's not really all about gender at all. It's often about just the capacity for those who can successfully use force, using it against those who cannot successfully defend against it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I've stood in many different footprints within the pattern that is violence between humans and sexualized violence between humans. And, you know, it's a kind of unselfing to do that, to go from being a person who identifies strongly as a woman, who has a lot of anger against men, and then to be confronted by my community and my people I'm studying Dharma with about that, and start to deconstruct the biases and the ditthi, the views I have about hatred and violence, and then to go into shelters and work as a Buddhist trying to have compassion, but then to go into prisons and try and work as a Buddhist to have compassion. It's definitely a main core quality of my life history.
It sounds like there's some very interesting threads in listening to you describe this, that there are not one, but many different influences upon your experience that are conditioning anger and hatred and the whole ball of wax of negativity. And then I wanted to ask as well around that, if that's the case, what it's like for you when you're in, say, the prison system and you're working with someone who has perhaps perpetrated violence, and how you hold that space in your own heart when you're doing that.
Something about your question reminded me of a childhood story, a story from my mother, that the very first words I said were no. And that for weeks, all I would do is yell no whenever I had the opportunity to. Mm-hmm. I mean, they talk about how there's aversive types, and I definitely think I'm one of those.
Yep, I'm with you.
But in terms of the prison, what's it like? That's a big question, and it's a difficult question to answer, not because the words are hard to find, but because it's such a emotionally charged and often personal topic for people hearing discussion about it, that anything I say can be hard to know how others will hear it. Mm-hmm. And I certainly want to be careful. But I'll tell you that one of the first tools I use is that I remind myself the difference between the story I know from reading an offender's file, a man's file who I'm going to sit with. I'll often just take a brief glance through their criminal file, so I know a little bit about what may come up, and I'm not surprised. Mm-hmm. And that's a story. There are words on a computer screen, and though they point to a moment in the past, what I am receiving is mostly my mental images that I form from those words. And to know that that's very different than the moment that I'm with the fellow I'm with, and that knowing what I know about him is 3/4 just actually having images in my mind that I created, and feelings that are being generated from the images in my mind that I created from the words on the screen. So I do use a kind of a slightly deconstructive Buddhist phenomenological approach to say this is not happening right now. I am having feelings and I have opinions and I have memories, but those are in me. I'm bringing those. And my relationship with those are for me to manage with myself. And then here's this living human being across from me. We both know he got here. Circumstances, one of which was his own actions. So that's not erased or forgotten. But is that why he's talking to me? Why did he come to see me? What does he need? What is the role I've chosen to have to sit with him? Lots of little deconstructions to help keep the nightmare story from becoming real in my mind and heart. And also real honesty about when a person comes to me, and if we do talk about anything related to the offenses they were convicted of, to know that they have their experience of it that is also in their mind, and has their context that I don't understand, and that there's a real possibility for freedom for both he and I, if I can just hear with the best of my ability, hear with compassion and wisdom what's being said. It's taking things as they are that lets me face someone who 20 years ago I would have wanted to do harm to. It's learning how to just take things as they are and accept that the world includes this, or has included it. And now this is where we've gotten to, and my job is, from my own practice, to be the wisest, kindest, most present chaplain I can be. That's my job literally, and that's my job from my Dhamma life, and I can do this.
Yeah, and I like the way you characterize that you can be, acknowledging that you're not always going to be perfect. You're going to have your own internal responses, and that can sometimes be challenging. And that's not a wrong thing. That's acknowledging your own humanity.
What you were just saying, I think, relates to what is so hard about having a just prison system, because many staff have not had reason to or context for developing a sense of their own biases and what they're bringing into their interactions and what their reactivity is. They may not know. And so, how to say this? Prison is an artificial community. It's a fairly imbalanced and unnatural kind of community. Humans would not normally put themselves into a situation like what you see in prison. And so there's a kind of natural disharmony and ugliness to just start off with in the human interactions, because they're embedded within this context of control and one group having the authority to use violence against another group, and a big implicit moral judgment. And all of that can really feed into a person who works in a prison making a stand about, these guys are just criminals. These guys are just evildoers. They're just bad. And I am not them. I am not bad like they're bad because I work here. I'm not incarcerated. But if you study Dhamma, and even if you just study your own mind, you come to see how impermanent your state is. And if you have been able to face your own hatred, if you're like me and you've had a bunch of anger in your life, you actually know your capacity is there to do harm, to willfully and happily be angry and lash out at people. Mm-hmm. And that even though there's a kind of a teaching that says all acts of violence have a sort of a deep pain to them, a dukkha, the living experience of that for someone who's not, say, all that tuned into their heart and being compassionate towards themselves, may be that there's no dukkha, there's no pain in doing violence. Mm-hmm. It could be the most powerful moment of their year. I used to feel angry partially because it made me feel brave, and I wanted to be brave. I learned how to be brave by being an angry person and taking these huge risks fueled by the heat of anger. And I know that because I've spent a lot of time trying to investigate my own hatred and investigate my own aversion. But if you've not done that, then you may not understand that the sense of strength you have is based on aversion, is based on ill will. And it can become very complicated to try and talk about things like the injustice in prison for me, because I feel like it's there, but it's also just a concentration of everything humans do to each other, the way that we look at each other and talk about each other and make ourselves feel better by hurting each other.
So in your own explorations of your own anger, your own hatred, and judgment that may be part of that as well, what have you found to be helpful to you in being with that, and not even necessarily letting it go? It might not be that. I'm not foreordaining a conclusion about it. I'm curious just to hear how you receive that and what you do.
I had some advice from a Theravadan monk quite a few years ago, Ajahn Sona, who is the abbot at a monastery here in British Columbia.
Birken Monastery, I think.
Yeah, Birken Forest Monastery. He was giving a public talk right after there had been the actions of the ordination of women in Australia.
Yep.
And then the follow-up from the hierarchy in Thailand of the forest lineage. So Ajahn Sona had come back to British Columbia and was giving sort of a public talk to the community to explain what had happened and where he stood. And I was curious. Buddhist, but still curious.
Yeah.
Trying hard not to be. But afterwards, he came up to talk to me, and he said, everything you asked, they're great questions. Everything you said, totally appropriate. Don't be quiet. But know that anger is like acid, and your heart is like a newborn baby. And when you let your heart bathe in acid, you are hurting yourself. And that image felt so accurate, that to feel the anger, the strength of it, the bravery of it, whatever, also was to feel this burning away of something innocent, not even innocent, but just without defenses, something like a baby, where you've got this pure manifestation of life without defenses, without opinions and views. And he said to me, you need to protect your heart first and foremost. And I took that advice really deeply and have worked a lot on learning how to treat my heart like my own newborn child. And it started with work I did in yoga and somatic work that honestly, I spent a few years mostly laying on the floor, holding my hands to my chest and speaking soothing, loving words to my poor battered heart, and then learning how to breathe and move and feel that same love to my own battered heart, and then how to teach and engage with men and women who were victims of violence or who were in communities of drug use that I felt connected to, and also be speaking to my heart and protecting my heart in a way of first and foremost, if I find aversion and anger coming up in me, I need to withdraw my energy from outward action and bring it back to checking in on where's my heart? Am I dipping my heart in the acid of ill will? And I use that a lot. And I in some ways I've just boiled it down to the gesture of placing my open palm over the center of my chest and turning my eyes down and feeling. And in a bigger sense, I have certain chants that I use, metta phrases that I have practiced with so many thousands of times that they're right at hand, and markers I look for that tell me, oh, you're not safe anymore. And when I'm not safe, when my heart is starting to be pained by what is arising in me, then I need to not try and pretend like I'm ready to be a chaplain, let alone just ready to be a decent human being. Like, that's not the place to be. Externally focused is not when the heart is aching. And so a lot of what I've done is spent years working on developing a relationship with myself where I removed the violence. I guess I should have maybe said this in the discussion of where did I start, but the day I decided to start healing, the day I started to begin investigating yoga and then eventually Buddhism, I took a vow that I would do no more violence to myself. I knew that it was an overwhelm of violence, internal and external, done by myself and others, that was driving me into the ground. And so I took a vow that no matter what happened, I would not do violence to myself anymore. And that specifically, I would not use my practice to do violence to myself. So even at the beginning, I took a vow that I would never judge myself for how often I practiced yoga or for how much I meditated. I would never use my meditative practice as a way to measure my own success in my life, and that I would never make my own personal path submit to the opinions of others, that I would use the actual experience of it as the measure of it. And that vow is one that I renew often and try to keep true to, that this path will be my safety that I promise myself from now on. And that's the start of being able to sit with someone who's done something that I feel I can barely stand to read about, is to start with, I know I'm safe with me. And since I'm mostly with me, even though with other people, that's like a lot of safety. It's a lot of safety to be really aware that I'm safe with me.
And you're in the best position to do that more than anyone else.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I also wanted to thank you for bringing up Ajahn Soma. I've loved his tea time talks, which are online for many years. Just really appreciate the insights that he brings. So, Kyira, I'm wondering what else you would like to share with listeners on this, or maybe one of the other topics that we could always go into.
Well, I was thinking of another story about learning how to do this life I have. I've been a prison chaplain for about 3.5 years, and when I started, I immediately stopped watching any movies that had to do with crime or violence of any kind, because I needed to not have that be just saturating my day. And, it took a couple years to just really feel solid with being able to be empathetic and be kind no matter who came in my door of my office. And after a couple of years, I decided I was a little bit okay to try a movie. And there was this one movie I'd really wanted to see, which is Room, with starring, I think, Brie Larson. I like her so much, and I wanted to see what she did with the story. And I started to watch the story, and I watched about 20 minutes and had to turn it off to melt down on the floor and just sob, because my mind had started to recite this phrase, I know men who've done this. I know people who've done this. I have conversations with perpetrators of this kind of act. And while I had been, spending my first couple years as a chaplain working on how can I be compassionate with this knowledge in my head and this person in my presence, I hadn't yet started to integrate that into also how can I be compassionate to all the victims of all the crimes that have been done. And seeing the film representation of a victim of a horrendous crime, it broke my heart more than I thought I could handle. I really thought I may not be able to do this job. This job may be so alien to human capacity to do with this Buddhist open-hearted approach that I might have to just fall over and collapse and have a breakdown and never go back. And I cried for about an hour. I've never been so upset as an adult, and I felt the whole expanse of suffering, it seemed like, in the world, and how much we hurt each other. And I was so overwhelmed with how there's just anywhere you look, people hurting each other, people being victims to each other and then turning around and reversing the dynamic to victimize others. And I felt there's nothing in samsara that is liberation. There's nothing here that is freedom from this. And it really broke me open in a way that felt like I was touching something fundamental. I would have said samvega, which is a Pali word that means disillusionment with the pleasures of samsara. But over the weeks that followed, when I was trying to question this feeling that had arisen in me that this was an impossible task, I tried to work through it in a fairly scientific approach, and I asked myself the question, what has changed? What has changed that makes what I thought was possible seem now impossible? And the answer was not someone's been hurt, because that had been true from the day I was born until, it'll always be true.
Right.
It wasn't the issue that prison was unfair or that violence is occurring. The thing that had changed that made everything seem so unworkable was that I now saw in a much greater way the vast amount of harm we do to each other. And that really what had occurred was that ignorance had been removed and knowledge had arisen. And I realized that this is at the heart of the Dhamma, the heart of the path is the removal of ignorance and the seeing of truth. And if the way I'm holding myself seems like I can't handle that, then I need to look to, is my job a problem being a prison chaplain? But I need to look at, is my way of being a person setting me up to make truth impossible? And I had said I had a lot of practice and I've done a lot of study in anti-racist movements and whites educating whites about racism. But for me, this is a stunning example of what I understand it means to be raised white. And I use that term specifically to mean in North America, in a post-slavery cultural world that denies so much of the exploitation of Black and brown people, is that I had really got this feeling that I couldn't handle the reality of pain in the world. And the only way I can have that feeling is if I was raised from childhood up to believe that wasn't there. And the only way that could be something I believed is if I lived in a world where it wasn't there or could be hidden. You know, it for me, this whole question of pain and crime and hatred also includes race in North America so much. And so my capacity to do what I do, some people say sometimes that they're impressed with my capacity, but I think, oh, well, that started the first time I read Martin Luther King's letters from a prison. That started the first time I read James Baldwin or Bell Hooks. You know, my capacity to do what I can do started with Emma Goldman. It started with civil rights activists and labor rights activists of immigrants and indigenous people, and their writing about how their life mattered, that I began to set in place the seeds that let me become the compassionate holder of space in a prison. And so I really feel like so much about civil rights, all the political activism I did in my youth is what allowed me. So the very thing that was the source of the motivation, which was this anger that came up in me, was also the place where the capacity started to grow in me as well. And I think that's a really interesting thing to hold on to, and Buddhism affirms that often, that there's a kind of simultaneity of freedom and suffering in all things, and that anything can be self-liberated if it's seen with a clear mind and an open heart. And there's this huge capacity, even when I talked about being a person who's an aversive type, as I understand it, the aversive type benefit is that if you can take your negativity and split it apart into the aversion part and the discernment part and liberate the discernment from the aversion, you end up incredibly discerning and really able to see things as they are. So everywhere that we have a lot of energy, we have the potential for a lot of liberation. And all these places where we've been hurt and have hurt each other are places of a lot of energy in human communities. So they're places we could have a lot of liberation.
There's great potential there.
There's great potential there. That's right.
For our guest today, Kyira Korrigan. Kyira, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Ted. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.